In this video, I want to talk about the chunk of metabolism centered on the molecule acetyl-CoA. The idea is to give a high-level overview of these pathways so that we can be prepared when we see individual pathways to understand how they connect into the rest of what's going on. So let's just dig right into this. So here I'm showing a map of central carbon metabolism from humans. I've shown this before. There's all these different metabolites and these different pathways that are connecting things. And to help us make sense of this, I've used the analogy before of a transit system, right? So the idea is that a transit system has individual stops and lines and individual train networks. Likewise, metabolism has individual metabolites, individual metabolic pathways, and then individual metabolic networks. What we've done to date on my videos is I focused on things that are within the glucose network. And in the glucose network, everything's kind of interchangeable with each other. That would be analogous to, say, in the Portland transit system. All of the MAX lines are connected. You can go anywhere that you want to on MAX, going from basically train to train to train, going from stop to stop to stop. What we're going to be talking about today is a different network that's adjacent to and touches the glucose network, but is on a different set of rails. And so, for example, that might be the streetcar. The streetcar, lets you go down the center of Portland, but you can't just get on a streetcar and then expect to go to where you can go on the MAX. Instead, you actually have to change systems at specific spots. So we're going to see the same thing here with our transit network or our metabolic network we're talking about today. The acetyl-CoA network touches and is adjacent to the glucose network, but they are actually quite separate. Okay, so here's what we've talked about thus far. This is the glucose network. If you've seen previous videos on this, you've seen me talk about glycolysis and gluconeogenesis and the pentose phosphate pathway. I don't want to get into that. If you want to go see those videos, you can check them out. But I likened each of the pathways or I gave for each pathway a specific job or role that it tends to play. So for example, glycolysis is used to release energy, right? You get ATP out of this pathway by converting glucose into pyruvate. The non-oxidative PPP down here is used to build anabolic starting materials. So what we're going to do today is talk about something very similar, but now on a different metabolic network. And this network is over here, and it is a metabolic network that is, instead of being centered on glucose, like the glucose network, it's now centered on acetyl-CoA. So let's start introducing the molecular players. Like I said, it's centered on acetyl-CoA. This is part of that molecule. This is known as coenzyme A. And it's this big, complicated looking thing. If you look carefully at it, you'll notice it looks like it's part of an adenosine base. In fact, there's a chunk of an adenosine base here that it's built out of. It's all got all this complex stuff. And fortunately, to understand metabolism, we don't actually have to understand how this is made. We just have to know what it's used for. And what it's used for is it is a handle that can be recognized by enzymes that's used to move around carbon moieties. And so I said this is part of an acetyl-CoA. This is the coenzyme A part. An acetyl group gets attached here to the end of this, kick off this proton. And now we've got acetyl-CoA. So this is a handle that's moving around chunks of carbon that are going on to do other parts of metabolism. And it's used in both anabolic context for building up bigger things and also in catabolic context for breaking things down. So this is the sort of central unit of this chunk of metabolism. The other players that we'll run into, which I'll just mention really quickly, we're going to run into free fatty acids, quite a few of these. And free fatty acids are molecules that have a carboxylate on one side, then a long chain of acyl chain on the other side. And we're also going to run into things like ketone bodies, which if you look at ketone bodies and you look at an acetyl group and a free fatty acid in a ketone body, you'll notice they have this carboxylic acid or this carbonyl adjacent theme. Turns out that's a theme across all of the molecules inside of this metabolic network. So let's talk about what's actually in the network. These are the characteristics. So first of all molecules are built from or can be converted into acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA cannot be made into glucose, at least in animals. We don't have the metabolic machinery to go between these networks. So it's a one-way trip. We can go from glucose into acetyl-CoA, but not the other way around. And we're going to see oxygen ends up playing a really important role across these pathways, particularly on the catabolic side, the breaking down side. Oxygen is heavily involved in this network. So like I did for glucose, what I'd like to do is actually take apart each of these individual lines so that we can understand how this system is put together. And I'm going to do this using the transit analogy. So I've got each of the lines here. Don't worry, I'll make myself disappear when I start blocking important things. But we're going to fill this in with the different sorts of pathways, or what the pathways do. Okay, so actually I'm going to disappear. So the first one we're going to talk about is the pyruvate connector, which generates acetyl-CoA starting from pyruvate and going to acetyl-CoA. So it's basically what we're doing here is we are going to connect pyruvate, which is at the base of our glucose network, into our acetyl-CoA network. And we're putting it in this central position, right? This is the center of this network is acetyl-CoA. We're moving pyruvate in. Now we've made it into the network. And we're going to have a whole video about that one reaction because it's a really important one. Okay, there's our pyruvate connector. The next thing, a very core part of this as well, is the citric acid cycle, which is actually a one-way loop rather than a standard metabolic pathway. Its primary job is to generate ATP, and it goes from acetyl-CoA to ATP. But there's a whole bunch of other metabolic roles that we'll hit as we go. But we can think about it. What is it doing? It's for ATP generation. And if acetyl-CoA is here, the citric acid cycle is here, looping around it on our transit network. So it's looping around, moving acetyl-CoA molecules and turning them into ATP. All right, third connector. Third thing I want to talk about here is beta-oxidation, which is used to release stored energy. So you take fatty acids, you convert them into acetyl-CoA, and then those can be, say, fed into the generation of ATP citric acid cycle. This is paired with the formation of fatty acids, and this is fatty acid and triglycerides, which we'll get to. But fatty acid and triglyceride synthesis take acetyl-CoA and turn it into fatty acids. And I put these up here. These come off of the main citric acid cycle, but they're involved in the creation and breakdown of fatty acids. Final one I want to mention here is this ketone body network and this or subnetwork. This has we can import these things called ketone bodies and turn them into acetyl-CoA, and then we can also export these. We can take acetyl-CoA and we can turn it into ketone bodies and we can export them. And we'll see as we go on that this is actually really important for how we respond to, say, starvation conditions is through the production of these ketone bodies. And another really interesting thing is how parallel this network is to the glucose network, right? So if we think about the glucose network, there are a variety of different sort of pathways that do different things. So for example, glycogenolysis takes glycogen and breaks it down into glucose subunits. Beta-oxidation inside of the acetyl-CoA network does the same things. It takes free fatty acids and breaks them into acetyl-CoA. So glycogenesis releases glucose molecules. Beta-oxidation releases acetyl-CoA molecules. This is paralleled by the opposite response or opposite pathways. We have glycogenesis storing glucose, fatty acid synthesis storing acetyl-CoA. We see something similar with glycolysis. So glycolysis takes glucose and turns it into ATP. This is this mobile energy unit. Things like ketone body import and the citric acid cycle take those energy packets and make them into ATP. And then finally, hopefully you've recalled that gluconeogenesis is used by, say, a liver cell to create glucose to put into the bloodstream. We see the same thing with ketone body production. If you're under starvation conditions, the liver switches over and starts taking ketone bodies and dumping them into the bloodstream. So again, it's running parallel to gluconeogenesis. And so what we have here is a metabolic network that is very different from, adjacent to, but has similar roles in some ways to that of what we've seen already inside of the glucose network. And what we're going to do is in a set of videos tackle each of these different lines, these different metabolic processes. Okay, that is what I have on that intro. I look forward to digging into the acetyl-CoA network with you. Hope to see you soon.